You are listening to WRFG Atlanta. WRFG provides a voice for those who have been traditionally denied open access to the broadcast media through the involvement of a broad base of community elements to guarantee that access. In the utilization of the facilities and its programs, the following communities will receive first priority: those who continue to be denied free and open access to the broadcast media, and those who suffer oppression or exploitation based upon class, race, sex, age, creed, disability, sexual orientation, or immigrant status.
My name is Heather Gray, and the program is Just Peace. And I'm pleased to tell you that this evening we're going to be talking with a remarkable media activist, actually, Tracy Rosenberg. She is the executive director of the Media Alliance in the Bay Area in California. But I'm going to ask you to go into some in-depth description of your work, Tracy. Welcome to the show, actually. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's just a pleasure. Give us some scope of your remarkable background and the work that you do.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. Media Alliance, which is the nonprofit that I direct, was founded back in 1976, not by me, and has basically spent the last 45 years operating as sort of a bridge between the media and the not-for-profit and social justice and change communities in Northern California. And I would say for the past decade and a half, we've been active in areas of communications policy and communication rights, and specifically as that impact vulnerable and marginalized communities at the intersection of class and race. In terms of my Pacifica experience, I will say that in 1999, I was arrested for entering KPFA after security guards had cordoned it off in what is often known as the Pacifica Troubles and the multi-year struggle that led to the democratization of the Pacifica Foundation. After that, I worked at KPFA as the program coordinator for a year and a half, coordinated KPFA's program council, which at that time was an effort to sort of open up programming decisions and guidance to the station's larger community. I worked as the local election coordinator at KPFA in 2006, was elected to the local station board in 2007, and served there and on the Pacifica National Board until 2013. In 2014, I started an independent publication called Pacifica in Exile, that I guess now we are at 8 years that I've been writing it off and on, which is basically just a blog with an email subscription that sort of talks about internal matters at the Pacifica Foundation, sort of in the context of media activism and in the context of supporting the ongoing existence of the Pacifica Foundation. So I'll stop there.
Oh, well, thanks so much for that remarkable explanation about your work, Tracy. I know people are going to wonder, so what was the issue around the time about you being arrested, actually, at KPFA in California? What was that about?
Well, people might or might not remember this, but back in the late 1990s, Pacifica is what we call sort of self-selected or non-democratic governing board, proposed a number of kind of startling changes to the operations of the Pacifica Foundation, which of course had been around since 1946. And some accidental leaked information sort of indicated that these board members, who were basically just chosen by previous board members in a sort of, ongoing self-selecting chain, were looking at possibly selling the Berkeley station or the New York Signal and taking those funds and in investing in a bunch of smaller stations in the South. There were significant program changes going on at both stations, including management that was perceived to be hostile to a bunch of the workers. There were union changes. Unpaid staff, for example, were kicked out of the UE union and a great deal of internal turmoil that basically terminated with a scenario at KPFA in July of 1999, where literally programmers were interrupted on air. The station was cordoned off by hired private security and also the Berkeley Police Department for a period of time. And programming was literally piped in from Texas to replace the local programming. In other words, everything blew up. The station was raided. And it kicked off a sort of 3-year struggle that encompassed all of the Pacifica stations to basically stop these changes from happening and to put in place a democratic governance system that was controlled by the members and the subscribers so that nothing like this could ever happen again.
Well, thanks so much for that explanation. And, I think what would be a good idea also, Tracy, for those who might be listening and not all that familiar with Pacifica, please explain the infrastructure about the 5 stations owned by Pacifica. Go into a little bit of that history.
Yes, and I realized that I didn't answer your specific question about why I was arrested, so I will do that.
All right.
Approximately one day after the dramatic ripped off the air and the programming being piped in, which of course listeners at WBAI will identify with because something similar happened to them in October of 2019, which we can talk about. But anyway, one day after that happened, there was a big protest in front of the station, and then a number of folks who really felt that a statement needed to be made put up a ladder in front of the station and climbed up in public up to the 2nd floor in order to enter the station that had been basically cordoned off to the community and make a statement that it was still ours and we still cared about it and we were going to sort of take it back. So I believe it was about a dozen people, and we were in fact dragged off by the cops and put into jail.
Wow.
And that was one of my first encounters with KPFA up and close. And I guess it should have taught me that it was going to be an interesting life experience.
How long were you in jail?
Oh, not long, just overnight. The original charge was felony breaking and entering, and then it was dropped to a couple of misdemeanors, and eventually the whole thing was dismissed and thrown out of court. But that took a couple of years.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the history of Pacifica, the 5 stations and so forth. Could you give an overview of that?
Yeah, Pacifica is, sort of often called the parent entity of public broadcasting in the United States because it predates both PBS and NPR and everything that we sort of understand as public media. In the 1940s, a bunch of folks, primarily Quakers, got together in the Bay Area. A number of them had been part of sort of commercial broadcasting, and they were frustrated by how it worked. And they basically wanted to experiment with something extremely different that they called non-commercial, listener-sponsored broadcasting. The idea being that rather than sort of advertisers calling the shots, they would try to create educational broadcasting and basically ask their audience to kind of pay for it and support them to keep on going. So this whole idea that anybody but commercial advertisers who were trying to sell you things would support radio or television programming was actually something that Pacifica more or less created. So in 1946, they incorporated a not-for-profit foundation to sort of bring this experiment to light. And in 1949, their first signal, KPFA, went on the air in Berkeley, and it has broadcast uninterruptedly, except for that period in 1999, since 1949. As Pacifica grew and this experiment sort of drew interest, they were able to secure other licenses. Some of these were gifted to the foundation, like WBAI, for example, and others they were able to sort of pick up at a cheap price. And so in order, they were able to add stations in Los Angeles, New York, Houston, and finally, Washington.
Yeah, remarkable history. So I'm just curious to hear from you also. What to you has been the impact of community radio in these various cities and around the country? Well, let's talk about Pacifica. We can go into something about community radio, but let's just talk about the Pacifica stations. What sort of impact do you think it's had in these communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to say that one of the sort of founding principles of Pacifica, and where in fact its name came from, was the idea of pacifism or active opposition to war. This was sort of a founding philosophy of the Quakers. And it is something that Pacifica, basically, when the mission statement was written, the idea was to engage in all kinds of educational and cultural programming, but all of it working towards a society with less violence and less war. So Pacifica has basically, over its years, tried to provide an alternative voice on just about everything. The idea being things that were sort of unspeakable in the sort of general commercial broadcasting world, but that were of value, could basically find a home at Pacifica, both in terms of being able to sort of say what couldn't be said at the time, and in order to sort of find the people who wanted to hear it, to find the alternative audience. Nowadays, there are so many voices out there and so many different ways to sort of broadcast and publish and express that the importance of that is not as clear as it used to be. But you have to realize that in the 1950s and in the 1960s and in the 1970s, this was really the only place where things could be said that were not welcome in the commercial broadcasting universe. And so it was a refuge and a sanctuary for all kinds of ideas that are much more mainstream now, but at the time were what you would call unheard, unsaid, and truly not conventional.
Like what?
Oh, I mean, if you look at the folks that Pacifica broadcasted over the years, you had the pacifist point of view about World War II and the Korean War before sort of anti-war activism coalesced in response to the Vietnam War. Folks on Pacifica were saying these things 15 years before the Vietnam. Right. You had people talking about race and segregation, and you had them doing so a decade before the civil rights movement exploded. You had people talking about gay rights and women's rights, again, a decade or more before these movements exploded. So you basically had a scenario where points of view that were not just minority, but that were basically ahead of their time were sort of able to be heard and able to find an audience in significant, large media markets in the country. It was extraordinary. What you often see in sort of modern day Pacifica is you see an awful lot of audience who will tell you that their politics were created and their minds were opened by Pacifica stations when they were young, and they will never forget what the impact of that was on their lives.
And then from this, other community radio stations were created across the country as well, right? I mean, like our station in Atlanta was in WRFG, was inspired by WBAI in New York. And I know this is true around the country. There are hundreds of other community radio stations around the country now.
Yes, a number of sort of movements evolved around sort of the Pacifica idea. And even though the foundation itself never acquired any stations after WPFW, a broader sort of community radio and community media movement sprung up, and a number of individuals went out, found licenses that essentially no one wanted on the band, and tried to sort of start Pacifica model stations. And there are hundreds, if not thousands of those all over the US. Approximately 210 of them currently are what we call Pacifica affiliated stations, which are basically programming partners. They're not owned or licensed by Pacifica, but they play some Pacifica programming. And there are additionally hundreds of other stations that are just out there using the same sort of model. And we saw in the 2000s the low power radio movement, which bears a great deal of its inspiration to Pacifica, which went out and basically started micro radio stations, really small stations that aired at 100 watts or less, and really tried to tightly serve hyper-local areas with location-specific programming. And there are hundreds of those as well.
So the interesting thing to me about Pacifica, but also about the affiliated stations, now WRFG that I'm a part of is affiliated to Pacifica. We take some of the Pacifica shows and then pay Pacifica for those shows. I so appreciate us having that opportunity to take some of these Pacifica shows. Actually, it's just wonderful. So, but it is inspired so much, not just on news and information, but culture, Tracy. I'm talking about music and culture from all over the world. Our station in Atlanta has programs on South America, from Africa, and so forth. It's just so impressive to me.
Absolutely. Music, which of course is well suited to the radio, drama, theater, visual arts, all of these things have sort of, long been talked about on Pacifica stations, and often when it was difficult for them to find audiences elsewhere.
Thank you so much for that. So Pacifica's been around for a number of years now, decades, but there seem to be, you were talking about struggles at KPFA in California. So right now we're in the midst of yet another effort to try to alter the existing structure of Pacifica. So what on earth is happening?
Yeah, well, the story here, and, it's important to say that Pacifica has certainly been, turbulent throughout its whole history. And I think the reasons for that include lots of creative, smart, intelligent, unconventional people who were butting heads. And of course, the reality is that even though the internet has changed this somewhat, there are only X number of hours at a station for broadcasting. I think it's 160 something in a week. And those slots are, highly coveted. And so there is always a certain amount of sort of creative tension about who's on air and who's not and why. And so that sort of turbulence about how those decisions are made and who's featured and who isn't is sort of endemic to any sort of community-based radio effort. Because, of course, in the commercial sector, these decisions are easy. It's about money. When you move to the non-commercial sector, it's about a lot of things, including your mission and your goals. And those are things that are much easier to argue about than dollars and cents, right? Which are really literal. But that said, that turbulence sort of took on, I would call, an almost never seen before level of intensity, as I said, into the late 90s and early 2000s. And what came out of that? Because essentially two stations were largely, I think, undermined, raided, or attacked, including KPFA, where it was kind of visible. There were cops lined up outside the station and you couldn't get in. And you heard alien programming on the air, not the locally generated stuff. And also in BAI, where they also had highly unwanted and controversial management and programming changes. And so the members and subscribers of the stations who really felt that they had built these things, that they were paying for it, and that it was, it was a community asset that they had a stake in, really organized all over the country to basically say, board, these are not decisions that you can make unilaterally. And we're going to sort of change this structure so we can do something, because the problem was these board members were in place. And even though what they were doing was wildly unpopular with the folks who were paying the bills for the stations, there wasn't any way to get them out. That's what it came down to. So people organized for sort of a structure that would have some direct accountability to the subscribers and that would essentially make them members of an organization with kind of membership rights. It's not an easy thing to turn a 501c3 corporation, which is what Pacifica is. It's a registered nonprofit with the state and the federal government. But it's not an easy thing to change a registered nonprofit from a non-membership organization into a membership organization. It's pretty hard. And what happened was that after agitating for a significant period of time, organized listeners went to the California Attorney General. Pacifica was always licensed in California, so that was the party who sort of had power. And they basically petitioned and said, let us do this. We have to do this because we have a situation where the board is not responsive to the community of an organization that is funded by and essentially belongs to the folks who have supported it for all of these years. So give us rights as members. And even though the government almost never does that, in this particular case, the government said, okay, we will let you put new bylaws in place, even though the board is not in favor of them. And those bylaws will contain rights for the members and give them membership status. And this was essentially historical. This almost never happened. So basically, the listeners mobilized and they brought what we call listener democracy to what is the nation's only real non-commercial media network that crosses the whole country. It was a really amazing development and time. And Pacifica has been run in that way as a membership organization starting in 2003 to the current date, which is 2021, which brings us to what is going on now. Democracy has been extraordinarily important, but it hasn't been without its challenges and its problems. The system that was put into place in 2003 set up local boards at each station, which were chosen by the members who vote 2 out of every 3 years. They elect half the local boards 1 year, half the local boards the second year, then there's a year off. And those local boards send 4 of their members to a national board. So essentially no one can be on the national board who is not vetted by the members of the station. They have to choose them. And that national board becomes basically the governing board of the organization of all 5 stations. And I think that it's been clear that some of the members take that responsibility really seriously. They try to elect the best possible folks. And some of the members maybe not so much. They listen to a program, they like it, but they've not necessarily embraced their role as literally selecting the governance of the organization as important. Some people would say that people have been put on local kind of national boards who maybe don't have the right experience or don't really know what they're doing. And we can talk about that a bit. But it's sort of drummed up a certain amount of, well, maybe we should change this system. So people are looking at these bylaws and basically saying, democracy, yeah, but maybe not too much democracy. So there's been desires twice now to sort of rein in these bylaws and rein in this democratic experiment. The first of these sort of bylaws changes was put to a vote in, I think it was March of 2020. And it would basically have provided an entirely self-selected board. So you'd be going back to sort of the pre-99 version, where people who have prominence in media of various kinds would just be put on the board. And there's no direct accountability mechanism. Once they're on there, they can do what they want to do and basically pick the people who will come after them. That went down in a membership vote overwhelmingly. It was 2/3 negative from the members who said, we don't want to go down that path. We tried that. It didn't work.
You're listening to WRFG Atlanta 89.3 FM. The program is Just Peace. And this evening we're talking with Tracy Rosenberg about the history of Pacifica Radio and some of the current issues being addressed.
Now there's a new bylaws proposal. It's called the New Day bylaws that basically tries to split the difference and sort of let people vote for the board members, but not entirely. And that sort of hybrid proposal will now be going out for a vote. I believe it will be in June.
What do you mean by not entirely?
Well, when you take a look at the New Day bylaws, what you basically have is a sort of a reworking of the accountability structure that I would call kind of faux democratic. In other words, there are a little bit of fig leaves that sort of make it look as if it's not just a self-appointed board, but when you sort of dig into the details, there's a lot less accountability. So the way that the New Day bylaws would change things would be that 4 people would be specifically placed as sort of the opening set of officers of the national board. And those folks include 3 people that have already served on the Pacifica board under the old system in the past couple of years. Jan Goodman from KPFK, Lyndon Foley from KPFT, and Aki Tanaka from KPFA. These are 3 sort of, former members of the PNB who would be coming back and who would be installed as officers. And Sharon Kyle, the author, the editor actually of the LA Progressive, which is a sort of online opinion magazine in Los Angeles, who has never been part of Pacifica governance in any way, shape, or form. And she would become the president of the board. And these folks would serve for 3 years. And then
I think it's important to note here that there are no representatives from the station in Washington, D.C. or in New York.
Not in the officers of the board, 0.
I see. Okay.
And if you're talking about a board that's supposed to operate on behalf of all 5 stations, it's kind of weird that you wouldn't include an officer from 40% of the network. And you have 2 officers from Los Angeles and 1 from KPFA. So certainly California is being placed in the driver's seat under the New Day bylaws. Then these folks can appoint up to 3 at-large representatives. And then there are a set of elections to pick the other folks that include 1 listener rep from each station instead of 3. So you have sort of the local station representation dropping by 75% because there's currently 4. And when you're talking about PFW and WBAI, the East Coast stations, they would simply have 1 representative in total. That's it. And none of them could be officers of the board, which is kind of crazy. And then you would elect 1 paid staff representative for all 100 people or so that are employed by the Pacifica Foundation, and 1 representative for what we call the unpaid staff, which are all of the people who volunteer their time. And there are like 1,000 of those, and they would get 1 representative as well, which of course is essentially 1/10 of the democratic strength that the paid staff have, right? Because you have 1 person representing the interest of 100 paid staff, and you have 1 person representing the interest of 1,000 unpaid staff, which is significant. And then this would be your new national board for 3 years, no changes. And then you would kind of go forward with that structure. And what it comes down to is that this is sort of a democracy deficit. Yes, people are voting, but they are voting for far less representation than they had previously. And the system is very much weighted towards giving significant influence to the California stations in a way that sort of is very different than the sort of equity model which exists under the current bylaws, which basically say every station gets the same representation on the national board, period. That would change, and it would change significantly.
Okay, so you've talked about the lack of representation, but it seems more along the lines of a corporate structure to me. Your opinion of that, please.
I don't know if it's a corporate structure per se. I mean, generally a corporate structure is, almost entirely hierarchical. This is really kind of a hybrid structure that says, well, we'll give you a little bit of democracy. You can vote, but it's kind of like our US elections where sort of you can vote, but there's often not really anybody to vote for.
Yeah.
Because yes, you can vote, but the people that you vote for largely have their authority and their ability to impact what happens significantly reduced over the current structure. What's interesting about the New Day bylaws is that all of the sort of, people who are involved with the Pacifica station have been getting email after email from the proponents of this, basically excoriating the current board and saying democracy has failed, we have to change things. And yet 3 of the 4 people that they're installing as officers for 3 years are people that have served on the National Public Board. Jan Goodman, the vice chair, did a 6-year term that ended in 2020 on the PNB. So she was an active player in all of the things that she is now saying were all screwed up and have to be changed. Akio Tanaka was the board secretary in 2017. Lyndon Foley is on the PNB right now. So they're basically saying, let us take over this entity that has failed, even though we were on it before. And this time things will be different. This time we will do different things. I mean, the question is sort of, if you were on the PNB before, why couldn't you do all of the things that you are now claiming that you will do? It's basically a question of sort of critiquing the very thing that you were a part of and trying to turn it upside down. And the question sort of becomes why, and the question sort of becomes what will be different, except for the fact that certain people will be elevated to positions that they didn't have before. These are not people who were chosen to be officers in the past, except for Tanaka, who was once chosen to be secretary, saying, put us in these positions and we will act completely differently than we did when we were actually on the board.
What will they do?
Well, that's a really good question, because basically they haven't told us. And it's an interesting thing, because normally when you have an election to sort of put people into an office, they have to run and they have to tell you what they're going to do. And there are other candidates and you get to sort of choose them. What we have here is basically people who are running a campaign for office and doing it under the guise of a bylaws change. So they're sort of saying, change the bylaws, and as a byproduct of that, we will ascend to these positions without running for office in a contested campaign. So in a way, they're trying to say, put us in these positions, but we don't have to tell you what we're going to do. We just have to change the bylaws, and then we don't have to run for things. And I think that people should definitely pay attention to that, because for better or for worse, a contested campaign with multiple candidates is how you find out what people are going to do, because they get challenged and they have to justify why they want to be in these positions. And if people are basically saying, I want to be elected to this position, but I don't want to have to run against anyone to get it, then basically, no, you are not looking at democracy. You are looking at something kind of different. And that's why I'm saying this is a democracy deficit kind of situation.
Tracy, one of the things that I've heard repeatedly from a number of people who are very concerned about these New Day bylaws is the threat to WBAI. Could you say anything about that?
Sure.
Just so the listeners know, WBAI is the station in New York. Go ahead.
The WBAI story is kind of long and complicated, but I think one important thing to say is that for whatever set of reasons, because it was a long time ago, in 2005, the Pacifica National Board signed a long-term contract. The contract actually expired in 2020. So it's a 15-year contract with the Empire State Building in order to sort of continue having BAI transmit to set up their antenna on the very top of the Empire State Building. Now, there's a reason why you want to be on the tallest building possible, because your antenna can then cover as much of the surrounding area as possible. But 4 years earlier, the World Trade Center had fallen down. And so basically the Empire State Building was the only game in town. They were the tallest building left that accepted antennas, and they sort of had a monopoly on the marketplace in terms of radio antennas. And being capitalists, I mean, the owner of the Empire State Building is a very successful real estate entrepreneur. They did what people do when you have a monopoly. They raised the price. And so Pacifica, which, is a financially struggling not-for-profit organization, for God's sakes, was in a difficult position. And what the board did was it basically went ahead and signed this 15-year contract with what is basically called an elevator clause, meaning it went up every single year, and it didn't just go up 1% or 2%, it went up 8% per year. So it started out as semi-affordable, even though it was expensive, but over the 15 years, it rose up to a level that basically no nonprofit radio station could ever expect to be able to pay, at least not a Pacifica station, right? So at year 5, it was bad. At year 10, it was catastrophic. And at year 15, it was basically impossible. So WBAI for a number of years was stuck with having to pay $30,000, $40,000, or $50,000 a month just to broadcast. And so they were permanently in a state of deficit structurally because they just didn't have that kind of money. And in fact, no Pacifica station has that kind of money. If the California stations had a $50,000 a month bill every month, they would also collapse. So WBAI was permanently tied to red ink for a number of years. And that was largely used to punish them and blame them for financial problems throughout the Pacifica Foundation. Now, WBAI is now out of that contract. They left in 2018 and moved to 4 Times Square, which is also a tall building, but not quite as tall. And their rent has now dropped by 75%. But of course, all that red ink accumulated for all of those years. And in October of 2019, an executive director by the name of John Vernile, who is not with the foundation anymore, decided that he would solve Pacifica's problems basically by taking WBAI off the air. Now, he didn't really ever get board permission to do this. He had a couple of board members, like 2 or 3 out of a board of 22 that he sort of conspired with behind closed doors. And the next thing anybody knew, a couple of them had flown to New York. They walked into BAI, just like Mary Frances Berry walked into KPFA some 20 years ago, locked the doors, took the station off the air, started piping in programming from California, fired all the staff, and basically took WBAI off the air. And it stayed off the air for almost a month, at which point New York's local station board went to court and said, look, the governing board of the foundation never said this was okay. And I mean, the governing board of the foundation has to authorize this. Can't just have this one guy, an employee, make this decision unilaterally. And the state Supreme Court of New York took that position and basically ordered BAI restored to the air. But obviously, since then, there's been a lot of paranoia in New York that is justified. So there's a great deal of sort of anxiety about the idea that basically there's desires in part of Pacifica to basically cannibalize WBAI and take it off the air and use the assets of the station, which include its broadcasting license, which is valuable. It's worth probably tens of millions of dollars to address sort of financial challenges. So when a bylaws proposal comes in that basically tries to significantly reduce WBAI's presence on the national board, that says all the officers of the board, none of them are from New York and none of them can be, the folks in New York tend to feel like it's a threat. And I think they have reasons to think that based on sort of, previous activities that have happened. And it makes sense to say that I believe it is 3 of the 4 officers that would be put into place by the New Day bylaws. One of them, Jan Goodman, was on the board at that time and supported this takeover. And at least 2 of the others have certainly said in the past that they were basically supporters of this takeover. I believe that Sharon Kyle has said the opposite. But it basically leads to sort of a perception that the WBAI channel or station or license might be on the chopping block, and that the folks who built that station and who listened to it and who have paid for it might be losing their local broadcasting out.
So I'm always quoting Dr. King. He would say, where do we go from here? So as far as what is the process now for this New Day proposal? What is the process? Who is voting on it, and when is this vote supposed to take place?
Yeah, one of the things that was put into place after the troubles in 1999 and forward was that if the bylaws were going to be significantly changed, not just sort of administrative changes, but changed according to their structure, that the members had to be able to vote on it, that it couldn't just happen because the board wanted to do it. So the New Day proponents put forward a petition. Some people signed it, and it is now the responsibility of the Pacifica Foundation to put it to a vote. That is going to happen in the first week of June. Ballots will go out. I believe the date is June 7th, and people will have approximately a month to vote. So the members, who are the subscribers who basically donate to and support the operations of the stations, and it's important to say that Pacifica is about 90% member paid for. In other words, subscriber income, mostly through those on-air pledges or telethons, is really the financial engine for the organization. It doesn't get a significant amount of income from other sources. And the members will be able to vote these new bylaws up or down.
I see. So, and that is taking place in June. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that the date that the ballots will be issued is June 7th, and people will have 30 days to vote. So the balloting will probably close August 7th or thereabouts.
Tracy, one of the things I wanted to mention before we end this discussion, I so appreciate you explaining all of this. One of the things that has impressed me about community radio, and that I think that Lou Hill, the founder of community radio in the 1940s, so impressed me, and what he intended was for community radio and for Pacifica Radio to be democratic in its infrastructure and in its programming. In other words, it would be something that the community would have a say over and be represented and so forth. It just strikes me that if the New Day was successful, that whole democratic process is basically destroyed, in my opinion. What is your opinion of that?
I don't think that there's any doubt that what Lou Hill and the people with him who founded the Pacifica Foundation, and it wasn't just Lou Hill, there was a whole bunch of people involved. What they basically wanted was not to have a boss. What they wanted was a scenario where there would be dialogue between the programmers themselves, the people who at that point were almost entirely volunteers, who felt that they really had something important to say, and the audience that they were able to build and cultivate, and that it would basically be a back and forth. And if you take a look at some of the things that the founders said, they talked a great deal about what we sort of call the two-way concept of media, that it isn't just a one-way thing coming out from the broadcaster. It's a back and forth and a creative tension between broadcaster and audience that has a financial component. The audience pays for the activity to go on, but they also sort of speak back to the broadcaster. And Hill was big on the idea of community forums and call-ins and bringing the audience onto the air and having them react to the programming that they were hearing. So it was very much a sort of an interactive model. And what the current democratic bylaws tried to do was basically take that spirit and bring it into governance, so that anyone in the community who's a subscriber to the station who had an interest would be able to run for a board, tell people what their ideas were, and if their ideas were supported by a significant amount of the subscribers, they could sit on a local board and have the opportunity to have input into the station's budget, into who the managers are, evaluating the programming, and sort of, really participating in the station community. And if they were so inclined, they could go to the national board and take on that position for all 5 stations, if the members of the local board had confidence in them and chose them for that position. So really, the current bylaws were an extension of the sort of radio philosophy into governance. So when we take a look at New Day, what we basically have is people saying, whoa, stop. And we don't really want to do that anymore. We want to basically put people into place and not have that sort of back and forth. And we want to have greater controls over what parts of the community get to participate. And we want to kind of centralize things. So it's just a small bunch of people without a lot of back and forth to the larger community. Because, for example, the local station boards were put into place so that the folks who live in the area and subscribe to the station would sort of have a way of egress for sort of the important decisions like, what's the station's budget? How does it spend the money that we give to it? What's on the air? Who's the manager? And one of the features of New Day is that it basically strips away all of that local control and puts it all in this nationally constructed kind of board. So there isn't really that communication back and forth between the local station and the local community in the way that is sort of envisioned in the current bylaws. And as I said, that's a sort of a democracy deficit. And it takes sort of the governance and the structure away from a sort of a local control model and sticks it all into a national model. And it sort of takes away the community give and take and the embedding of the station into its local community by way of governance and of structure.
Oh, Tracy, I want to thank you so much for that explanation. Thank you. And I also want to thank you so much for your great work all these many years. If there's anyone who understands anything about media, Tracy, it has to be you. So
thank you. That's so sweet, Heather. Well, it was lovely to have an opportunity to speak to folks today. Let me provide some contact information. The blog that I run, Pacifica in Exile, can be found online at pacificainexile.org. One word. You can subscribe at the website. And if you dig around in the archives, I mean, basically it goes back to about 2014. So there's all kinds of Pacifica history that you might be interested in checking out. And a number of the things that were spoken about here sort of have some real-time accounts of what happened. And regarding communications policy, you can make contact with the nonprofit that I run at media-alliance.org.
Tracy Rosenberg, thank you so much. Thank you.
I'm going to ask everyone to stay tuned for Revolutionary African Perspectives.